So the next couple of types of disorders we're going to be talking about: somatic symptom disorders, bipolar and related disorders, and depressive disorders. So somatic symptom and related disorders. Somatic symptom disorders are those characterized primarily by distress and decreased functioning due to persistent physical symptoms and concerns. So somatic meaning body. These disorders usually have something to do with an actual illness or a perceived illness. So these symptoms are usually not rooted in any detectable physiological disturbance. So the four subtypes of these disorders are somatic symptom disorder, illness anxiety disorder, conversion disorder, and factitious disorder. So in the first one, somatic symptom disorder, a person will complain about one or more, usually chronic physical symptoms, regardless of any physiological basis. So chronic headaches, for example, if a person gets chronic headaches, and they are constantly preoccupied with this, and it's causing them stress and it's causing them distress thinking about the fact that they have these headaches and how much it's taking away from them, it's going to increase that anxiety. And the diagnosis requires the presence of reduced functioning due to the anxiety over the perceived illness. So that's the biggest part. If the anxiety over the perceived illness, it doesn't even have to be, doesn't even actually have to be a debilitating illness. It's just the individual's perception of their own illness causes them anxiety. That's the basis for somatic symptom disorder. Then we have illness anxiety disorder, which is similar to somatic symptom disorder, but the somatic aspect is not the focus of the diagnosis. So it doesn't really even matter. And a lot of times people with illness anxiety disorder may not even have what they're saying they have. They are just so anxious about their health. Just as a general person, a character trait, the distress comes from the person's anxiety about their own health. We also have conversion disorder. That's one in which the person experiences changes in sensory motor functioning without a discernible physiological cause. So symptoms typically begin after emotional conflict or a stressor is presented. Glove anesthesia is an example. So there have been multiple examples of a person completely losing feeling in their hand, in their entire hand. However, no other part of their arm is affected, which is not the way that your hand and your arm is innervated. It's innervated in different sections. So one nerve that goes, say, up the right of your arm will innervate the right part of your arm as well, will innervate the right part of your hand as well. So if there's something wrong with the nerve input, then we would assume that the entire part of the arm is experiencing some sort of harm, but it's not. In the case of conversion disorder, it's a very atypical pattern of anesthesia. It's just the person's entire hand is just completely anesthetized, and there's no physiological cause. So that's why we would term it conversion disorder, because it has to do psychologically. And then factitious disorder, an individual will fabricate an illness and will either falsify information or cause harm to induce an injury or an illness. So this can be imposed on a person, like on oneself or on another. And this is more commonly known as Munchausen or Munchausen by proxy if it was done on someone else. So a person can do this to themselves. The actual DSM terminology is known as factitious disorder imposed on self, or to someone else, and it's usually a child. And then in that case, it would be considered factitious disorder imposed on another. So the diagnosis requires this behavior even when there is no obvious benefit. Now we have bipolar and related disorders. So bipolar disorders are those in which people experience cyclic mood episodes. So that oscillate between two poles. And the two poles that we refer to are depression and mania. So during mania, that should say a manic episode. During mania or a manic episode, a person may experience an increased energy, impulsiveness, irritability, euphoria, psychomotor agitation, and an increase in goal-directed activity without necessarily having the focus to complete on it. So psychomotor agitation also just means maybe you're sort of jittery, you have sort of movements that don't really make sense, you might be fidgety. So all of these are evidence of mania or a manic episode, and they can really vary in terms of subjective experience for the person experiencing them. Sometimes people objectively like having manic episodes because there is sometimes a euphoria associated with it, and they feel so productive. So these people will go maybe a week with having 2 hours of sleep a night. Maybe they'll go to the gym for 5 hours and, you know, just do something that is super, super productive, but it's not healthy. It's not a sustainable behavior and it's not healthy. These symptoms must be present for at least 1 week to be considered a manic episode. And during these episodes, the individual may feel energized on 2 hours of sleep and may experience psychotic features that could lead to hospitalization. So there may be some positive symptoms that we will talk about when we discuss schizophrenia, but those sort of symptoms may be present during mania as well. And then on the opposite end, we have a major depressive episode. And in one of those, a person experiences a depressed mood for at least 2 weeks, as opposed to mania, which only needs to be 1 week, remember. And they experience at least 5 of the following symptoms. So we have depressed mood, decreased interest in activity, significant increase or decrease in appetite, excessive or insufficient sleep, agitated psychomotor ability, fatigue, feelings of low self-worth, excessive guilt, impaired concentration or decision-making, and thoughts of death or suicide. So it's really interesting that when you read this symptom list, a lot of the paired symptoms are complete opposites. So significant increase or decrease in appetite, excessive or insufficient sleep. And that's just kind of more evidence for the biopsychosocial paradigm where even if there is just one biological root, it's going to affect everybody differently because of the psychological and the social component. So whereas one person may be experiencing an increase in appetite during their depressive episode, another person may not want to touch food and not eat for 3 days. So we experience everything differently. So bipolar 1 disorder is diagnosed when an individual meets the criteria for a manic episode not caused by a medical condition or medication, because there are certain medications and there are other medical conditions, somatic medical conditions that can, create behavior that seems manic, that mimics a manic episode. So although bipolar 1 will usually include a full depressive episode or a moderate depression, a person may still receive a bipolar 1 diagnosis in the complete absence of depressive behavior. So in order to be diagnosed with bipolar 1, all you need is one manic episode. If a person has a manic episode, they will obviously be screened for other conditions. They'll obviously be screened and asked if they did ever have depressive episodes, if they had ever had moderate depression or anything like that. But regardless of if the depression is present or not, if the person has a manic episode or a mixed episode, they meet the criteria for a bipolar 1 diagnosis. So a mixed episode, like I just said, is an episode during which they meet the criteria for a depressive and a manic episode, and their symptoms are present nearly every day for at least a week. So as long as a manic or mixed episode is present, bipolar 1 diagnosis is feasible. Bipolar 2, however, is used to diagnose a condition in which the person has experienced a major depressive episode and a hypomanic episode, but does not meet the criteria for a manic episode. So hypomania is just a less intense form of a manic episode. Sometimes it could last a little bit shorter. The symptoms are not as severe, and sometimes there are less symptoms that are present, but basically it's the same thing. It's just probably not as disrupting as a manic episode. So if a person, say, is suspicious that they have experienced the manic episode or even a hypomanic episode, they may go to a psychologist, explain their experiences. If they don't meet the criteria for a manic episode, they most likely will meet the criteria for a hypomanic episode. So it's not enough to just have that hypomania for a bipolar 2 disorder. You need a major depressive episode as well. Whereas we just said before, bipolar 1, all you need is an episode of mania. So bipolar 2, you need major depressive and a hypomanic episode. And then the third one is cyclothymic disorder. Sometimes it's referred to as cyclothymia. And it's similar to bipolar, but the individual experiences less intense symptoms for a longer time. So they're basically alternating between hypomanic episodes and mild to moderate depressive episodes, pretty much for years it could be. So they should meet the criteria for alternating that are never absent for more than 2 months over the course of over 2 years. So as long as it occurs for more than 2 years and there has never been a break that is longer than 2 months, they will probably be diagnosed with cyclothymic disorder. Okay, so we have some depressive disorders. So depressive disorders affect an individual's mood to the point that it causes significant personal and/or interpersonal distress. So in major depressive disorder, a person has suffered at least one major depressive episode. So these symptoms do not constitute major depressive disorder if they occur within 2 months of bereavement, because depression, depressed mood is considered to be just a normal process of bereavement, and it's a normal way we handle grief. The issue is that if it persists longer than we can explain it, um, psychologists would probably start to look toward major depressive disorder. So depressive episodes may also be influenced by the seasons. What was once referred to as seasonal affective disorder is now known as major depressive disorder with seasonal pattern. Persistent depressive disorder, which is formerly known as dysthymic disorder, is a less intense but chronic form of depression. So people with PDD will experience mild depressive symptoms constantly for at least 2 years, but without the presence of major depressive episode. So we had cyclothymic disorder on the other page. Cyclothymic disorder was sort of like the lighter version of bipolar. Persistent depressive disorder is sort of like the lighter version of major depressive disorder, where it's just this sort of less intense depression, but it goes on for a very long time. So this diagram to the right, you can take a look at if you'd like. It's just the M and D to the left on the y-axis just means mania and depression. To the right, you see the type of disorder we're talking about. And this basically just maps a person's, basically just a person's state throughout time. So bipolar 1, for example, you see that there are multiple manic episodes over here, and this person is also experiencing depressive episodes. They don't need to have experienced these 3 depressive episodes to be considered bipolar 1, however. So this line on this top one could actually not even ever cross this x-axis, and we would still consider it to be bipolar type 1. If we move over here and look at this mood state, bipolar type 2, you have these small peaks. Those are indicative of hypomanic episodes. So if you look up here, back at bipolar 1, we have these larger peaks, which are clearly indicative of mania. These are not as tall, so we would assume that they are hypomanic episodes. However, when we look at the bottom, these are some pretty deep peaks over by the D. So we know that those are depressive episodes. And again, we need a hypomanic episode, at least one hypomanic episode, and at least one major depressive episode to be diagnosed with bipolar 2. And then we have unipolar, which is just major depressive disorder. Unipolar meaning is just depression without mania. And you could see it stays below the whole time, picks up a little bit. It is cyclic in nature as well. And even towards the end, the person is a little bit above the middle. So maybe that person is seeking treatment and maybe it's working.